And thank you so much for joining us today at Johns Hopkins University's SAIS Rethinking Iran initiative. I'm Narges Bajogli, an assistant professor here at SAIS. And along with my colleague, Professor Vadi Nast, we'd like to welcome you to today's book forum. Our book forum events are 1-hour conversations with authors of recently released books on Iran. And we're so excited to host today's conversation because it brings together two of my great passions, which is scholarship and filmmaking. And it's even more of a treat because it's about one of Iran's all-time great film directors, Rakhshan Banietemad. The book we're discussing today is called ReFocus, The Works of Rakhshan Banietemad, which was published by University of Edinburgh Press and is edited by our guest today, Maryam Ghorbankarimi. Rakhshan Banietemad is one of the first female directors in Iran. The ReFocus book is the first English language study of Banietemad's films and career, with chapters by some of the most prominent scholars of Iranian cinema, and really in great fashion with a lot of younger scholars as well who have contributed to this volume, who offer fresh points of view, focusing on questions of aesthetics and politics, social realism, gender dynamics, and the after images and counter memories of revolution and war. The book also includes an in-depth interview with Banietemads herself, with the editor of the volume, who is our guest, Dr. Maryam Ghorbankarimi, who's a filmmaker herself, a film scholar, and a lecturer in film practice at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. Dr. Ghorbankarimi's current research is on transnational cinemas and cultures, specifically the representation of gender and sexuality in Iranian cinema. She's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and she's also developed a number of new practice-based modules in film at Lancaster University. And I'm just so thrilled to have her on here to discuss this book. I read it as an ebook, so I don't have it to hold up, but I really enjoyed reading it and learning from the different perspectives that are brought into it. So first of all, welcome, Maryam. It's so nice to have you here. And I want to start with the question of, what does Banietemad mean to you, and why is it that you focused and spent so much time and energy in bringing this book together? I want to get to who is Banietemad in Iranian cinema, but I want to start with who is Banietemad to you.
First of all, well, I guess good afternoon to your audience in America, and good early evening in the UK. Thank you so much, Narges, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be with you today to talk about actually one of my biggest passions. Someone who actually, her work probably was one of the reasons I wanted to do a PhD and work on the work of women filmmakers and bring out the contribution they've done. And her work has always been one of the most kind of impacting on myself as someone who was growing up in a filmmaking family, who was in a cursory, actually knew both Puranda Rakhshande and Rakhshan Banietemad because they used to be classmates with my parents. And seeing that how much they are influencing and changing the cinema since I was a kid. And I to just give you an anecdote of having had a chance to see her film, which you bear the name, Narges, from 1991. I did see that film at the Fajr Film Festival when I was about 10 years old. And even right then, I remember coming out and asking my parents lots of questions. I was like, I have not seen anything else like it. And at that time, there was not enough, I didn't have the right vocabulary to kind of analyze it further. And they were trying to teach me that how much she's actually bringing elements from pre-revolutionary Iranian cinema and is reintroducing them back into Iranian cinema of the time. Years later, when I was planning to do a PhD, I knew that my elementary kind of preliminary research had led me to this, that 1990s saw the big change in representation of women in Iranian cinema. And I couldn't find anything before that film, Narges, that really kind of set us on that kind of the move that brought a lot of great male directors in the 90s, like Bahram Beyzai or oh my God, this is the brain fog that I was mentioning beforehand. Recovering from COVID, cannot remember Mehjui's name. Yes, that they started making female-focused films. And so this was something that I kind of pursued as a PhD, during my PhD, to kind of look at the first female directors and their contribution to Iranian cinema in the 90s. And that has turned into a book, and it had come out. But as you can see, that even to this day, there's not enough kind of single focused works when it comes to film festivals, even while a lot of us like yourself and across the world, we try to bring more emphasis on to the works of great directors like Banietemad. A lot of times their work are being classified in certain kind of areas, like women filmmakers just do kind of social criticism, and but not being looked at fully from the aesthetics of it and overall contribution to cinema. And so I always had this, that I need to do something. My PhD wasn't enough. There's not a lot of other works coming about. I'm very grateful to one of the editors of ReFocus, my colleague, Stephanie Van de Peer, who when she joined the ReFocus series, she came back and said, I've heard you talk about this director. Why don't you put forward a proposal to do this? And I was just like, there was a moment of hesitation, and but then it was a leap of faith to see, are there other scholars out there who feel the same? And it didn't take long to find other interested, because when you go to Iranian cinema has grown so much, and I understand that while there's a lot of scholarship, there's still not a lot of recent scholarship on recent directors. So a lot of conferences, a lot of younger scholars are focusing on the current works that are coming out. But I feel that thinking about history of cinema, there's still certain figures that need to be highlighted fully to give them basically the space they deserve. While I'm sure in all of our disciplines we're thinking about decolonization, Iranian cinema studies is fairly young, but it still needs to be decolonized, because early scholarship still focuses on some of the great directors, but predominantly male directors coming out of Iran. And sometimes I feel that great contributions like Banietemad has always been given a second kind of thought. So that was a good chance to kind of bring her work up. And I had a personal connection with her. I had done interviews during my PhD as well. And once I just got back in touch with her, she was very generous, although she basically told me, there's a lot of interviews with me. There's even this TV series online. Are you sure there's nothing new that I can contribute? And I was just wanted to say that if I'm doing this book and we're trying to bring our readings of her work into it, I wanted to have her voice in it. So that was something that mattered to me. And if those of you who get a chance to look at the book, you can see that the interview chapter is written in like first person. It's not about my questions, it's about the way she has told us her story. And there are gaps in it as well, but these are the most important elements that were important to her to talk about over the 3 long sessions of interviews we've had together. And so yeah, that's how this project came together. Sorry about a long-winded reply.
No, it's a great reply. You know, I was actually, as I was reading the interview you had with her, I thought it would be like a traditional interview, and then I was looking for your questions and I didn't see that, and I thought, okay, let me read this as Maryam wanted this, you know, like, let me read this as her talking to the reader. And I actually really loved that you did that. It wasn't something I expected, but once I realized what I thought you were trying to do, I thought it was really effective. And you're right, like there's obviously a lot of gaps in what she's saying, but the things that she highlights gives you such a depth of understanding of her understanding of her work, her understanding of her life and the experiences in her life. And I loved how she talks so much about, and I wanted to get you your perspective on this, but also for you to sort of talk about it with folks who haven't had the chance to read this interview yet, her own upbringing, and how when her father passed away, they really, at the age of 9, I believe, they lost socioeconomic class status. They went down in socioeconomic class status. And that meant that she grew up in parts of the city around folks who were working class and around folks who had certain kinds of struggles, which then made so much sense to me in the types of films she ends up making later. And she continuously refers back to that in her own interview about especially the social documentaries, but also the narrative films that she makes. So what, if you can also sort of bring up to date those of the folks who are watching or listening who haven't read that interview yet about what she brings into it, and especially of her own history and how that ends up impacting her filmmaking.
You're absolutely right, and yeah, I'm glad it actually came across that way. That I really wanted her to have the voice in the book, and she talked about the drastic change in her life, and then unexpectedly she come across sections and strata of society that she had not a chance beforehand, and that her getting involved to transcribe these kind of petitions for this person kind of make her understanding of the struggles people go through, and this is something that it feels like she's trying to not be distant from the society. So it is not wrong that many scholars over the years have called her as like a social realist or social filmmaker, because she is making film for that society. And she's very much so very close to her city. She's very close to the place that she was brought up. She has observed these changes, and this change, it's in the architecture of the city, as well as the demographics of people that are seen, and bringing the people from the peripheries to the center. This is something that I also in my own chapter tried to kind of link between, because a lot of us when writing about Banietemads talk about the fact that she stems her work from documentary filmmaking. This is what she was interested in at the start. And then she gained quite good success in her feature filmmaking and dramas. And some might, when come to look at her long kind of body of work, they can see that there's certain gaps between every single film that has come out. But a lot of times in between those, there's short documentaries or engagements and research that is taking place, besides the regular issues any filmmaker faces in Iran based on the changes of censorship laws and regulations and political climate, as well as financial restraints that do exist. But at the same time, this is something that it feels like from a young person that she was, and then the decision of doing what she wanted to study at university changes, and she moves to go and learn more about filmmaking. She gets involved with television. And at the time, this is something that I've briefly looked at in my first book as well, that Iranian film industry in post-revolution is very much so a bit at odds in its starting years in the 80s, is that usually film industries are quite independent from television industries in most kind of developing countries, while in Iran, due to the revolution and the purges and the change of structure in the film industry, it kind of made it that people who were working in television in pre-revolution years in television kind of made their way into film industry and became the backbone of the film industry of the 80s. And this kind of made her understand both sides of things. And while it is basically the TV commissions that gave her the first kind of steps or backing to make her documentaries, it is that she knew the people who were working in the industry at the time that were also working in feature film that made her bridge between the two. This is something that I've asked her 15 years ago, and I asked her again about this kind of bridge between television and film. And she says she doesn't really see it as two different industries in Iran, at least not in her generation. It is something that has become that way. And there is that element that, yes, television is a lot more strongly kind of governed by the ideology of the government. But at the same time, a lot of filmmakers that work within that system, at least, especially the older ones, like her generation, they're almost like independent filmmakers working for television. And documentaries back at the time that she was always saying that they weren't getting that much airtime anyway. So you could be critical. They chose not to show it or show it at a certain time that people wouldn't see it, and so on and so forth. It's quite an interesting kind of journey she's had, and she reflects on it, and then she talks about her one of the questions that I think everybody brings up, or people who would neglect her first 3 feature films. This is something she addresses there as well, because while the first 3 feature films are the only 3 that she hasn't written the scripts for them, are the ones that nevertheless she has selected the scripts. So the scripts very much so attune with her ideology or where she would like her cinema go. And I do invite everybody to read Farshad Zahedi's chapter on those 3 films to kind of see this, because he does a brilliant job of looking at them from a fresh perspective, not just what most of us do, that she's an auteur director, but those 3 films were not written by her, so we're not going to look at it. They're not female-centric, so we're not going to look at them. So there is that element of a lot of us dismissing those films, but those are quite fundamental. And she in the interview, she addressed them and talked about how they were quite, while they kind of delayed the production of film Nargis, so she had the script in hand for a few years, but at the same time established her as a director. And that was her kind of way to get into the industry. And so those are quite important films. And very much so their topics are attuned to her works. And then she gets on talking about some of her films. I don't know, should I carry on, or would you like to come in with comments?
I want to actually, before we get into the specificities of her films themselves, I want to take a step back, because in your introduction, you cite Bill Nichols and his writings on Iranian cinema when it was starting to sort of bloom on an international stage in the 1990s, and how but really also you mentioned and you point to, and this is sort of ongoing today, how folks who write about Iranian cinema, critics who write about Iranian cinema, or those who review Iranian cinema, and see it in the festivals, not necessarily in tune with what's going on in the cinemas themselves in Iran. They don't know how to place or think about filmmakers like Rakhshan Banietemad, or even Milani and other female filmmakers. And you write about how actually when folks started to, when Asghar Farhadi begins to win his Oscars and make his films, folks outside are writing about how it's incredible that he's doing these social commentaries, and his films are about sort of these urban spaces that are different from the films of the earlier Kiarostanis and things like that had come on to the stage before Majid Majidi. But that in doing so, they're actually ignoring the work of Rakhshan Banietemad, who was doing this kind of filmmaking from Zira Pust Shahar, Under the Skin of the City onwards, if we take her narrative and documentary films into consideration. So, you talked about the need to decolonize the study of Iranian cinema and to bring in and how we're ignoring so many incredible female filmmakers. But can you talk about how you see the positionality of how those who are writing about Iranian cinema as this great sort of world cinema are also doing a similar thing, that they critique the Iranian state of doing, which is ignoring women. And Iran has so many incredible female filmmakers.
Yeah, I especially it's important to kind of put it in the context that Bill Nichols' paper is quite early. It's like 1991 or 1992, and it's one of the first kind of scholarly attentions to Iranian cinema, because there was that retrospective of Iranian cinema at the Toronto Film Festival. So if you think about TIFF, was quite early in its way to bring a selection of post-revolution Iranian cinema to Canada. And of course, it had a few films by notable directors that already international arenas knew about. So someone like Bill Nichols come to it, it's quite fascinating, because it almost feels that, because the argument of his article is to kind of come and say that how Iranian cinema has found its own new wave, it has found its own standing, which goes against the mainstream, the kind of classical narrative structure of mainstream Hollywood, especially cinema, and how it has exceeded or taken what other new waves in Europe have done. So what he's setting out to do is quite praising about Iranian cinema. It is the definition that I think to this day many scholars still clinging on. And we are grateful of the directors, as you mentioned, like Abbas Kiarostami, Majid Majidi, that or earlier Shahid Sales, who are responsible for that definition of the minimalist narratives, urban, rural settings for Iranian cinema. But those of us who do know Iranian cinema, in fact, melodrama settings in urban spaces, it's something that's quite set. It's quite a usual thing that 90% of films are set that way. But within that, what I find, it's the space that female directors actually chose to navigate. And because I think a lot of them, they do have this mission, at least Banietemad did, I think Puranda Rakhshan and Tahmin Milani, I've spoken with all three of them, had this mission of changing, kind of building culture, changing the culture, and they cared how audiences respond to their films. So they wanted to bring their stories in the way it would be palatable to the general public. And that would be through films that are more melodramatic, making sure that they do have stars acting in them and are in setting in environments that are used to. So that kind of makes it that something that I think they all navigate and try to challenge that kind of social norm that was created to kind of creating these one-dimensional characters that were being portrayed in post-revolutionary cinema. That's why all of a sudden when Nargis comes, or later on when Tahmin Milani's two women come, they are set in the framing of it is very much so a standard kind of melodrama, but it's doing something that those other films coming out that year were not doing. They were challenging the viewer at every turn, and they were representing women in a very different, nuanced way that no one else was. And this is something that I think it's what then great directors like Asghar Farhadi have taken on and brought to new grounds. And I chose to mention Farhadi not just because, well, everybody would know him. It's that he is a director that in many interviews early on has always given credit to people like Rakhshan Banietemad and showed that he's learned from it. He's a director who started writing and directing in post-2000s. And he mentions very openly early on that how much he's learned from great films by Banietemad. So when he is giving, as a filmmaker, from a male filmmaker from that country, is giving credit to those who should be given credit. It's interesting that then still critiques and scholars are not. And I found that article that I had mentioned in the introduction quite, in fact, unsettling to kind of say that trying to kind of creating a binary out of Iranian cinema. Like, I think no cinema should be looked at in those terms. that kind of stripping everybody down as if it's a industry that produces one type of filmmaker only. And while again, I think when we are passionate about a filmmaker, we want to kind of highlight what their achievements are. And in that case, I understand it, looking at the festival intakes, some of the Farhadi's first film, especially Separation, I believe is one of the first films that was collectively gone to a lot of festivals, that it brings that side of Iran, or earlier, in fact, About Ali does that. And it's something that, again, for an Iranian audience, it wasn't even shocking. Many critiques in Iran were even shocked that how come that film was selected? It's not doing that much of a different thing. But later on, now we see he has a very strong kind of authorial hand that bringing suspense, and the criticism on morality is something that is very big on his films, which then makes it unique to him. But the style of the film and the way certain social criticism are being dealt with is very much so built on the bricks that were laid for him in the 90s to go on. So this is something that I find, and I hope younger scholars out there who are coming to Iranian cinema fresh, it would be good to make sure to have a chance to see some of these greater earlier films and see what they've been doing, that some of the more recent directors are bringing to greater grounds, but they're not coming fresh out of nowhere. There's a continuity that exists. But at the same time, I have to also say this, there is this, that for distributors out there, it's also because of access half of the time. So a lot of the non-Persian speaking scholars writing on Iranian cinema only have access to films through festivals, through films that are distributed on DVDs, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things, that it's not just, it's the way that their films are not being distributed or seen as much, which kind of creates these holes and these gaps. For example, I don't know, like Artificial Eye, that has distributed majority of Iranian independent cinema for the English-speaking audience, has not done that for any of the female directors. So why that is, that's a good question to be asked. But I think now festivals have done their best. So I actually see a good change, at least since the 2010s, that pretty much a lot of the younger female directors who have been, their works have been shown across the world. But there's still, and those of us are trying to do retrospective for the earlier filmmakers like Banietemads.
Yeah, you know, when you brought up Nichols in your work, when I was doing my PhD, my advisor would always say to us, because we were focusing on, you know, sort of the anthropology of filmmaking, and she would say, someone needs to do a dissertation on the structures of film festivals, and who are these folks who are bringing festivals or films into these festivals, and what that means for what gets shown and what doesn't get shown. And Nichols was obviously somebody that we read a lot. And it is true, lately there have been a lot more female filmmakers that are being brought and shown, which is from Iran, which is very welcoming. You know, you mentioned in your response right now about how important it is for Banietemads to be making films that have, for her and Tamina Minali and others, that have a social impact within Iran. And she's quite famous, Banietemads, for really insisting that her films get permission in Iran, and that her primary audience is an Iranian audience, in order to push conversations forward or to make some kind of social impact, rather than her primary audience being a festival audience. And how she'll wait until she sort of gets those permissions and is able to screen her films, whether they're narrative or documentary. And so as you're, you know, I had cut you off earlier when you wanted to sort of go into the details of her films, but can you kind of link this to us, like her her desire to have these things be shown in Iran, along with the types of films that she has made, and the things that you think sort of stand out to you, both as a long time sort of admirer and viewer of her films, and also as a scholar of Iranian cinema.
Yeah, I think again, it's one of those things that something that it comes across. It's a term that has been used in, I guess, post-50s literature and then cinema in Iran, and I think which is being a committed artist, whether you're an author or a filmmaker in this case. And I think very much so Banietemads is someone who is committed to her art in a sense that her art has a purpose. So a lot of times she's talking about filmmaking as this is the pen I write with. This is just a device. And if I find another outlet that speaks better and reaches people better, I would have pursued that. So for her, it's a means rather than like the form of her film is not just the exploration of form, it's the content that she wants to bring to her audience. And I think it's quite fascinating that what she has done, and this is something that I for this volume specifically, I went back and rewatched her documentaries, and it was interesting because I already knew that I wanted to write about her documentary that's called Under the Skin of the City, as well, because that's a name that then she carries to this feature film, which is very well known, Under the Skin of the City, in a few years later to that. But in my surprise, when I went back to some of her earlier work, that's when I realized, oh, there's a pattern there. It's and who do you show these films to? It almost feels that we talk about, for example, my colleague, like a few of the contributors have wrote about the element of meta-cinematic, which Zahra Khosrowshahi brings in her chapter, as well as these kind of tales within tales, as well as the fact that her last feature film is called Tales, which brings anecdotes and elements from her earlier films. It's not just through that. It almost feels that she's had the same kind of argument and she's followed it and she's committed to it to make sure that those voices, those narratives have made it to the general audience. And until she's not satisfied, she has not left that topic or that story behind. And this is something that can be seen, is that she is very much so concerned about the people in the peripheries, especially people who come to the big cities for the hope of a better life. And this is something that even her first kind of one of the early documentaries about Tehran is kind of warning us to kind of think about this mega city is going to eat up these people and take away their individuality. And then in the film, that it's quite a brilliant, reflexive film. I think any documentary film student should watch it. Who do you show these films to? It's such a good film that honest filmmaker is going out to make this film, and very much so tells us as the narrative changes and involves us in the ups and downs that this filmmaker had to go through. And I think that style of it is quite catching. Like her and her crew, as she mentions, with a 16mm camera, were making another film, and then they realized there's this slum next door that was supposed to have been there temporary, but it's like 6 years on and people are still living in it, in those temporary accommodations. And then they find out, once she's introduced those people, and the way you see that people invite them, kind of drag them into kind of show, and in a way almost kind of to me shows that how much people actually trust in the media as well, because they feel that they know they're a crew from television, for example, so maybe some MP or someone will see it and respond to their needs. And then she is responsible because she knows the change is not going to come that easily. And she stays on her own good to make sure some of those people that have given their time, at least she gives her time to them. And I think that while it's very clear as a filmmaker, her hand is tied to go and change their life completely, because she does help city planning changes rules and help those people find permanent homes one way or another. But at the same time, it's not the outcome those people were hoping for. But at the same time, while she wants to kind of show them that it's not in her hand to do that, she wants to say that I didn't come and take your word and forget about it. She brings her half-made film back to those people and sits down and watches with them. And it almost feels like the satisfaction you see in those people's faces, that at least someone has listened to them. And they even comment on the fact that whether they were articulate or not, it's quite a touching moment of recognition. And so I think this whole idea of she wants people to be heard, it's something that is very important. And then that you see those characters coming to her fiction. Her film, The Blue Veiled, very much so has those people who live in those peripheries. And this young girl who, I mean, it's a love triangle and things change, but it is about one person who lives in the outskirts of a big city and is struggling to make ends meet. Her documentary, Under the Skin of the City, is about addiction and the growing addiction in Iran, and focusing on young people who and that's something that, again, the story of addiction, it's always been in her films. You have the mother character in The Blue Veiled who is addicted. You have even Under the Skin of the City, the film version, has a character who are smuggling drugs, as well as then her later film, Khunbazi, Bloodline, that is focused on someone who's going through rehab. And also, of course, in the May Lady, there are key characters that she comes across that are addicted. So this is one of those things I feel that there's certain topics that she has come across as a young filmmaker, and she has stayed with them to kind of see how these develop. So for me, that shows her commitment to her society, commitment to the people who give their time and heart in front of her camera. And she's trying at least as much as she can to give back to them by not forgetting them. It's one of those things that, even though the open-ended sometimes stories, you could think the happy end at the end of some of these films, she makes sure to come back to them to say that it's not that always that happy. While I think her work and trajectory is not, it's very optimistic at the same time, it's criticizing the society. Sometimes one of her films that is the hardest for me to watch is Tales. Those of you who might be aware of it, it's a film that brings kind of vignettes of her earlier characters 15, 20 years later, and we see them where they are. And most of them are not in a situation we would like to find them at the end of those years. So that's the only film that I think has a degree of pessimism in it. But at the same time, what I like about it, the protagonist, which is Sarah from that Bloodline character, played by her wonderful daughter, perfect actress, Baran Kosari. Still, when you listen to her dialogue, despite the whole narrative being quite pessimistic and kind of showing us the dark side of people's lives, there's still hope in it. There's a degree of fight. And that, to me, in itself, it shows that while she might be towards the end of her career, seeing that a lot of those lives haven't gone in the direction she would have wished for them, but at the same time, she still has hope in the younger generations. And this is something, again, I think her one of her political documentaries, if you like, Our Times, which is about the campaign for the second round of elections for Khatami, is about that hope. While a lot of us following that campaign, we knew a lot of people have lost their hope in what that second round of presidency can bring. There was still that hope, and it almost feels that prediction of what could have come if he would not get elected, which we then lived through a decade after. It is there as well. So there's that element of she has hope and she wants the better for the younger generation. She wants them to have a voice, and she wants them to, as a teacher in a way, to help them grow for the next. So not just the filmmakers that's making a film to be successful at the festival. She's grateful of films that have been, and her recognition across the globe, but at the same time, it is those individuals that she cares, that if she can touch or connect with a couple of them, that's what she cares about. And I think it's very clear in her films and her documentaries.
Yeah, and you know, this it comes in some ways, the way that she describes how she makes her films, you know, she goes and she lives with folks who have, for example, for Bloodline, folks who have addiction or who are addicts, and she'll do it for like a month at a time. She tries to really immerse herself. I mean, in a way that I understand it, it's very anthropological in a sense. She does a lot of participant observation. And she says that the folks who end up in her narrative films are not just characters from a page. And this is why they reappear, as you say, throughout her different films, because they're taken as inspiration from people who are alive and who are going through these different trials and tribulations, and also the hopes. And you know, because of what I study, and I was looking so much at war films for so long, and I think there's no better war film or more impacting war film than Gilane, even though it's not necessarily, you know, in the official sort of narrative of what war films are, it's not necessarily considered as such within Iran, but I think it's this deeply impacting, incredible film. And she says herself about why she didn't want to make war films in the 1980s or even early 1990s, because of that larger sort of state industry of making those films. But I know through, you know, when I was doing my research, I would see her a lot in spaces with different veterans. And she was doing it out of her sense of social responsibility and humanity about what has happened to people who have been injured in different ways on the war front. And then importantly, as I think she shows in Gilane, it's the entire community that surrounds them, that takes care of them, and how these different types of things, whether it's war, whether it's addiction, whether it's, you know, political campaigning, whatever it is, these have social lives that are not just about when those things end on paper, but about how they continue for much longer. And you really see this in her work, and it's coming across in a lot of what you're saying too. And for me, what's really fascinating is when she, you know, in the past few years, she's been making so many documentaries, and I've seen her show up at cinemas in Iran, Tehran, where these documentaries are being made, and she really lends her voice and her name to the issue that she is highlighting in these films. And in that way, she talks about herself as a social activist, not necessarily a political activist, but very much as a social activist. So I wanted to sort of ask you about both her process in the making of these films and her deep commitment to not just from the outside looking and then writing or looking and making, but really trying to go into the belly of what's going on, live it, and then write it. And that's why I think her films are so impactful.
Yeah, I'm very much, I completely agree with what you just said. And her social activism, I think it's something that, and her commitment to cinema, that's something that we know that the turbulent atmosphere of Iranian cinema in the past 20 years, with the Cinema Union and the Fajr Film Festival and the conflicts that it's ongoing. But at the same time, I'm very grateful of figures like herself and other prominent filmmakers that no matter what, are always kind of stood there to have a presence in making sure that their version of contribution to the industry has stayed alive and not being pushed away. One of the fears that always, whenever I hear, I think boycotting this and boycotting that, it almost kind of makes me quite fearful, because that might kind of open the arena, then someone completely takes over, and that kind of factionism that do exist within Iran, that good things pop up here and there, then would completely disappear. And figures like her that are noted have lent good hand to that. And I think she has been working really hard the past 20 years to make sure that she's endorsing other filmmakers. I think her collaboration with Moshtaba Mirtahmas in creating the Khorasan initiative was a very good way of kind of creating an independent kind of environment for younger filmmakers come together and make documentaries. That in itself, I think it's showing her commitment to the industry and trying to help other filmmakers, which we have brilliant filmmakers who probably would have become wonderful filmmakers anyway. But it is nice to see that a prominent filmmaker is endorsing them to take the center stage. I think like Barnavad as a great documentary filmmaker is someone that I came across her work through the Khorasan initiative and through Banietemads. And so you do see that and the support that she has for it. And also I wanted to kind of say that something that just go back quickly to while we were talking about the Banietemads not being recognized and not being given the space in scholarship, in English-speaking scholarship specifically, and film festivals, we should understand that that not necessarily is true within Iran. Even her first film has won the Fajr Film Festival, Nargis, in 1992. The reason that film is included in that series at retrospective at the TIFF Film Festival is because of that as well. So their films, interestingly enough, are recognized, are seen. In fact, the growing number of female filmmakers, that's something is that whether all of them are being, and their percentage is being recognized, that's something that someone needs to look into it further. But the first three directors who kind of established this in the 90s, they were quite well recognized. And a lot of other, so in Iran, I don't think there is that bias as much within the industry itself. Like her name is equally standing next to other great directors. It's only when it comes to the outside is something that all of a sudden women take not the center stage. And of course we can have these kind of cursory assumptions, is that no matter what, almost kind of an Orientalist view of Iran or the oppressed Iran that you want to represent in the 80s and 90s, it's hard to believe a woman can do what she's doing. So almost kind of the best thing sometimes, because you don't know where to categorize them or where to put them, is to not talk about them. Because if you do talk about them, then all of a sudden it almost feels that, how come when we're struggling today at the Oscars to make sure there's enough women filmmakers being recognized? In 1991, 92, an Iranian director won the best award that country can offer. There is those elements that doesn't really kind of fit the general specifications or general descriptions of Iran and how it's seen outside. And I'm touching on in grounds that you know a lot better than me about the politics of it. But at the same time, this is something that's quite interesting and always has been fascinating for me, that sometimes I just think many choose not to see them, one of the best examples, it's a wonderful film. I love her works, is Samira Makhmalbaf's films. Because if you think about it, the scholarship that Apple and then Blackboard has received is far greater. And I love those works. They're wonderful works, but they were not the first female directed films coming out of Iran. But the subject matters fit the certain assumptions coming out of the country. And it feels like that they fit the stylistic films that you would expect coming out of Iran. So those films did better in the international arenas than Banietemads or Milani's films did.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Maryam, because I think that one of the reasons I am always so perplexed is because Banietemads and other female filmmakers are actually, as you say, quite celebrated within Iran. Banietemads is seen as being one of the great filmmakers of Iran, and yet, as you're saying, they're not legible or in some ways outside, because then we have to upend our own frameworks or analysis of what we think of as post-revolutionary Iran and post-revolutionary Iranian society, because then someone like a Banietemads doesn't fit into that. So then we just, sitting from the outside, we just ignore it. And that's why I'm so grateful for your work and those of the folks that you bring into this book, because you all are saying, no, let's contend with this, and let's contend with how her filmmaking is is not only great filmmaking as filmmaking, but also is so well received within the country and society in which she is making those films for. She is speaking to her society, and she is speaking from her society. And so I want to, in the few minutes we have left, ask you about, and I wish this conversation could go on, but I want to ask you about the chapter, how you set this book up, the folks that you involve in writing the chapters of this book, and the topics that they touch upon. I love the breadth of scholarship in this book, and the different. I think you made a very conscious decision, and correct me if I'm wrong, to have different generations, to have folks who are approaching the study of films from different perspectives and different disciplines. So if you could just sort of take us behind the scenes and how you were thinking about this, and what are the other sections of this book about?
Yes, thank you. You're being very generous, but I'm also very honored about the wonderful contributions of all the colleagues and friends that contributed to this book. The initial steps was that before I actually approached to write and finalize the proposal to send to the Edinburgh University Press, I contacted a few of colleagues who their works are in the book to make sure, because they were people who I knew have worked in the past on Banietemads one way or another, or are very well versed in Banietemads' work. And once I had a kind of a handful of names that potentially told me that they would happily contribute to this, and they think, yes, this is a necessary book. When it was proposed, then it had a call for paper, and I really wanted to make sure, as you say, that there is voices from people who have been working and been involved in Iranian cinema scholarship for years, as well as the younger academics, early career academics that are bringing fresh point of views. It's interesting for me that someone who perhaps because there's a few scholars who, like myself, are living in diaspora, so they have a personal connection with the society as well, but they come from a different generation. So even that in itself, I think it's quite interesting, because it brings a very different perspective to the table. And so that was a conscious decision, and I'm honored to say that I managed to do this. And of course, there's a few colleagues that their names are missing there, but due to personal commitments at the time, they couldn't contribute to the work. But this the way it was, I just wanted to also make sure something that I was really hoping to. And at first it felt like more of a struggle, but then I also focused my work onto focusing on her documentaries. I still think there's, first of all, Iranian cinema, while we think there's a lot being written on it, there's still a wealth of films out there that have not been studied in detail. So at first it was a bit more of a challenge to find people who would want to work on the documentary section. And I would like to kind of thank, now that I have this space, both Fatemeh Mehrkhan-Salar and Bahar Abdi, who were old students of mine who have took on this challenge to work with me on this, to create that section, because I did not want to make a film, a kind of retrospective on Banietemads that did not include at least some in-depth analysis of her documentaries. As you know, in the world, in a scholarship, I was very conscious about this, that when this book comes out, for a few years, this might mean that no other book can come out until there's some time has passed. So I was conscious that we can give the breadths we can to it. So that created the final section about the fact fiction and society and her relationship of her documentaries. One section which could not have not existed in the book, which is part 3, it's that which is entitled Gender, Love and Sexuality. It's the topics that in any other scholarship up to this day, probably those were the topics that she's been put in the context of women filmmakers, looking at representation of women. This is something I had done myself in the past, and a few other scholars. So we needed to make sure that that conversation and the early readings of her book carry on into more updated version. And that is the largest section of the book, that you have a wonderful chapter by Rosa Holman, who looks at the male desire and subjectivity in her work, and the way the voiceover and enunciation works. And that really complements the wonderful work that Professor Ladan Nushin has put together, entitled The Affective Listening, a Sonnet Intimacy, and the Power of Quiet Voices in Banietemads films, especially the May Lady, which she comes from a very kind of unique perspective of how sound in film works. And those of us who work in Iranian cinema, we know actually sound is a discipline or area that very little attention has been given to it. So I think that that chapter is very unique in terms of what it offers. And then you have kind of the semiotic analysis of offered by Asal Bagheri, looking at the masculinities in her work by Nina Khamsi, as well as this is the area that I wish there were more work on, doing a transnational reading, a comparative reading of Banietemads and a Chinese filmmaker of the 4th generation, and looking at the mother figure and how it's represented in these two different societies by Yun Zihan, which I think while at some point I might have thought that like it would have needed its own section, but still it works really well alongside the other works that are on that question of gender. And the book starts with a section on aesthetics, politics, and narrative structure. And I really, again, that was very important to me to kind of make sure that that first section offers that new reading and the new perspective on her work, and not just looking at her film within the kind of frame of gender studies or women works, which that is the area that there's wealth on. And I was so pleased to, as I mentioned earlier as well, that Farshid Zahedi offered a very unique analysis of her first works, the works that I believe up to this day probably only had 1 paragraph or 2 paragraphs mentioning them in all the other works on Banietemads. So actually looking at it, that how what he calls like from Black comedies to social realism connects those 3 early works to where we know Banietemads has gone. And then you have the wonderful kind of theoretically enriched work by Matthias Whitman about Under the Skin of Society that situates and contextualize Banietemads' work in the social history of post-revolution Iran. I think that's a very kind of grounding work that really well connects Banietemads with its society that is made. And then you have the brilliant work by Michel Langford on the cinematic divan, which what I love about this chapter is that kind of bringing, kind of marrying like Eastern theory into what Persian poetry does and bringing it into Banietemads' work and aesthetic, which helps us understand the aesthetics of her work that goes beyond just social criticism. Which again complements really well with Zahra Khosrowshahi's paper, which looks at the meta cinematics in her work and the way the tales within tales are told within her work that all link them all back together. So these 3 sections, one is trying to bring the usual suspects, the topics we know and have seen being discussed around Banietemads' work, but bringing them to new grounds. Bringing some initial investigation in her documentaries. I hope other scholars take it further and go in a lot more in depth than what we could offer here, as well as looking at her work from a kind of a film studies perspective, film as a film and their aesthetic and how the narrative structure help deliver what the intention of the filmmaker was. I hope this.
That's amazing. Thank you. And, you know, unfortunately, we're out of time. But what I do want to say for everyone watching is that those of you who are at Johns Hopkins, we now have your book at the library. And it's available for everyone who's able to access our libraries. And for those of you who are watching at different universities, I highly recommend check your library. If it's not there, ask your librarians to purchase this great book. Because I really, before we end the session, just want to thank you, Maryam, for putting this together, because what you're doing is bringing the importance of Rakhshan Banietemad's work to an English-speaking audience. And it's a work that's going to live on for a very long time. And I think is going to hopefully make folks who study Iranian cinema or study Iran and have not had the privilege of watching Rakhshan Banietemad's work to pay attention to it and to understand how incredibly vital it is in our understanding of cinema and cinematic history writ large and on an international stage, but also everything that's gone on in Iran in the post-revolutionary sphere. So I really want to thank you for this work and for joining us and having this conversation. And we're going to have you on again. And I really encourage everyone who's watching to get this book and to watch Rakhshan Banietemad's movies if you haven't, because they're absolutely incredible.